Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think the first thing that I would like to put out there is that hopefully the priority will be placed on questions, because I've just from my experience within talks, quite often the talk happens and then it seems like we run out of time at the end, and I always feel bad for my students because I'm like, I know they have questions. So at any point, just please interject. And yeah, try to come up with as many questions as possible, because I think that'll be the most beneficial method of doing this. I have put together a little bit in terms of, yeah, giving you some history, I guess, of finishing uni and then where I went from there. So we can just share my screen, I guess, if you guys want to get started.
Great.
Cool. All right. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So as mentioned, I studied at RMIT in the same program you guys are all enrolled in, or were enrolled in. And I studied from 2011 to 2015. Going back to that time, I guess to give you a sense of where I left university, my honors project was very much surrounding the growing hype around 3D printing at that time. It's kind of funny because I look back now and I think I've found about like 10 other people who have done this exact same project, which is kind of funny. But at the time, you know, it was very interesting for me to investigate. So the whole premise was to look at why people don't like wearing helmets. And the main reason that I kind of found in the research was that helmets are really bulky and they make you look a little bit like a dork. So trying to use technology to kind of create custom fit helmets and then maybe push the materials part to replace the foam that we're using in helmets with other, I don't know, infill technologies that could be produced through 3D printing. So that was what I finished uni with. I think this is a question that a lot of people, you know, ask themselves while studying. And to be honest, I don't think that this is a question that needs to have an answer. But I kind of, you know, finished university and had some sense of the things that I was interested in doing. But I knew that the typical path was that you, I don't know, get LinkedIn and you start networking and you find studios and consultancies that maybe you can, you know, get hired on as a junior designer or something like that. But I very quickly found that when I was trying to enter that world, it just wasn't a place that was exciting me. And that's not to say it's not an exciting pathway. But I think it's really important to think about, you know, who you are as a designer and what excites you as a way of forming the direction forward. So in all of this space and ambiguity of figuring that out, it's nice having slides actually, because it forces you to come up with concise statements about possibly years worth of experience. But I kind of figured out that there was two things that I was doing. So one, through a lot of the contacts that I had made at university, I was lucky enough to kind of be brought into people's worlds in terms of design. So through commercial product design and research projects, which a lot of were funded through RMIT, but also with external partners and people like that. So that's one aspect which kind of kicked things off for me in terms of actually being able to use my skills as a designer. And then the second pathway, which was kind of something I was fairly focused on during university, which was a very hands-on approach to design practice, where it's not just about coming up with concept, but also figuring out how to make it and yeah, realizing the idea in the world rather than just inside of a computer, I guess. So this is an example of one of the larger commercial product design projects that I was lucky enough to work on with Dr. Leah Heiss. Many of you probably know her, but she's an amazing person with a really vast background, but has become really prominent in wearable and medical tech. So she's part of the Wearables and Sensing Network through RMIT. Anyway, so this was a Australian company who they're audiologists. So basically it's, you know, a clinic where people can come in and have their hearing tested. And of course, there's a whole bunch of products on the market to assist with people who have limited hearing. But they were kind of getting a bit stifled by the fact that they were essentially middle people in the process of getting hearing aids to a customer. So when somebody would go in and get their hearing tested, they basically had to, you know, tell them how much a hearing aid was going to cost, which if you get into the costing structure of any consumer tech or retail goods or anything like that, typically, you know, 50 to 100% markup. So the fact that they knew that they were buying these hearing aids from a larger manufacturer and then basically limiting the amount of Australians who would be able to, you know, live a better life through having better hearing, that became quite frustrating for them. So they had this very ambitious plan that they wanted to design their own hearing aid. And so we actually worked for about 3.5 years to take all of Leah's initial concept development and research, which was literally, you know, sketches on scrap bits of paper and random meetings and coffees about what a hearing aid could or should be, through to this final product, which, you know, we actually got to see launch on the market and see getting into people's hands, which was quite an exciting project for me to be a part of. But I will say that it was a really long project. So this image probably has a lot more meaning for me than it might from face value. But this essentially represents, yeah, that 3.5 years worth of iterating on designs. And so if you look at those very first few prototypes at the top left, these were kind of printed later on just to create the accumulated set of prototypes. But those models were created, you know, before we even had meetings with engineers to understand what the components were that were going to fit in. Essentially, all we had to go on for sizing and scale was perhaps existing hearing aids and how big they were to make sure that they weren't going to, you know, look ridiculous in comparison. But as the evolution of the product kind of went on and we got more clarity, you can see in that top row, there's one that looks like they have some kind of brass colored squares inside. Those were the magnets which clip the lithium-ion batteries into the charging case and then also snap the processing module on the top onto the battery at the bottom. And that was a big user-centered design element for elderly people who struggle with dexterity, might have arthritis. A lot of the time we kind of have heard and figured out through research that, you know, in aged care facilities, people wearing hearing aids, in some cases they would go weeks without being able to hear because they never mentioned to anyone that their hearing aid had stopped working, and they also weren't able to do it themselves. So that kind of explains the whole idea behind this modular snap and replaceable battery that's much easier for people to do. Anyway, but yeah, it was really interesting to keep bouncing back and forth ideas between engineers, and as the product evolved, to have to kind of update the design without losing the intent. And so this really faceted look to the hearing aid was all inspired through precious gemstones and trying to make a hearing aid something that was a form that people would want to wear or was desirable, as opposed to the kind of, you know, beige or boring colored prosthesis kind of looking devices that traditionally hearing aids have fallen into. So yeah, that was a very long project and was probably the most intense in terms of my antsy pants, where I get bored quite quickly and I always want to do something new. So this one really tested me in terms of continually coming back to work that had already been done. But the good news was, because there were so many partners involved in creating something like this, you kind of got to tap in and out of the project. So it's not like it was a full-time job working to develop this hearing aid. There were so many moving pieces and other people on the team. So yeah, this is another project that was kind of an interesting one, which fused the two areas of my work together. So dynamic neural arts, Jonathan Duckworth, who is also from RMIT, has started this company which is primarily focused on rehabilitation or physiotherapy, and using tech to kind of guide people's ability to, build muscle strength and things after injury, or the other various uses that you could have for something like this. But it's basically, they're 3D prints that are conductive and can interact with touchscreen interfaces. And then they've created all this software which kind of merges the two pieces together and creates a really immersive experience. But this one was kind of interesting because even though the scale and the scope of the project was quite large, they also had to test and develop tech, which is where the low volume production of 3D printing kind of came in. Because to get something like this injection molded, you'd be using quantities which probably wouldn't be cost effective or feasible, because there was so much development happening really rapidly. And so the ability to 3D print stuff kind of made it so that we could change the design quickly and have new models to work and test with. Probably leave that one for the moment. So in terms of reflection, I think this is actually an important thing to do. And I'm always encouraging students to try and reflect on what's happening, because so often I think we are so focused on moving forward that we never really stop to think about what we're doing and where we want to go. And I think more importantly, the reflection about, not necessarily about what I'm doing, but what was I passionate about? And so I think through those initial projects, I started to form this idea that I'm really interested in design in combination with making, which allows me to kind of specialize in low volume production. So I guess the problem with low volume production, and I kind of have this joke that everything is a prototype, because when you think about it, a product, even when you get to a commercial point where you can actually release a product on the market, there's always going to be the ability to find ways you could have improved. And so the idea of completion to me is kind of funny. And when you flip that the other way, I kind of asked myself about, can a prototype actually be the final outcome? And I think one of the ways that that can be true is if you start to develop a really specific skill set within ways of working that, I guess we're always asking students to become experts in particular areas. So if I can become an expert in understanding really efficient ways to get from an idea to a physical prototype or product in the world, a prototype can actually be quite refined and resolved, even though there's the possibility that it could be, continually developed. This was a project which absolutely terrified me when I got the opportunity to work on something like this, because it was quite a big project. It also involved logistics of designing and making something in Melbourne and then shipping everything and installing it in Tasmania. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mona and the Dark Mofo Festival. ESOP, I don't know if they're still doing it, but they used to sponsor the event, and part of that was that they would design kind of, immersive, interesting environments. Anyone who's been into an ESOP store knows that they're masters of creating really boutique environments that are incredibly memorable and engaging, which is why people love going to ESOP stores. And the idea behind this was called So Steadily Breathes the Skin, and it was a kind of kinetic sculpture. And you can see that grid of panels. That's over 200 CPU fans that are wired into series and then programmed to kind of blow air in a particular way. And this textile in the middle was a really elastic and free-flowing textile. And so then when air was blown from behind, it kind of, I don't know, it was super weird. Even now when I watch the video, there's a little video here of behind the machine and then the actual installation working. But they absolutely pumped this old refrigeration room full of a signature scent that they made just for this installation. And there was beanbags placed around, and it was really interesting to watch because people would come in and be there for like an hour and a half just watching this floating wall that didn't really give anything in terms of understanding as to how it worked. It was quite mysterious. So yeah, that was a really challenging one in terms of, I don't know, I'm not good with electronics, so I guess the other thing to point out here is that you should never be worried about projects being outside of your scope, because working with other people is crucial. And I'm sure as you move through your degree or career or whatever it is, you're going to kind of develop relationships with a whole bunch of amazing designers that specialize in other areas. So the idea of collaboration is something that I'm very on board with in terms of how, first year design is taught, and everything being group work as opposed to the individual. And this was definitely a project that wouldn't have been possible if I had just, tried to individually refine all of this. So in skipping ahead, dabbling in various projects and trying to figure out what my specialty area was, I decided to remove myself from the work and start a company, which is called Us From Space. And that's basically what I operate under now. And from that point, we've worked on various projects. This is an example of some of the more commercial work. So you can see in the few images, there's a whole bunch of furniture and fit out stuff that we've designed and made. So the daybed in that first image, curtain rails, mirrors, the lamp in the middle image, again, the mirror, and then the custom steelwork in the kitchen. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting project, which was much more about an entire space rather than a single outcome. And I guess what's nice about Napier Quarter as a company is their entire focus is on community. So not only the produce and stuff that they're using within the restaurant, but even the idea of having someone like myself actually think about the entire space and contribute to that on such a large scale. So that's been really nice. This was another example of low volume production where a brand like Remedy Kombucha, who's obviously quite specific and strong in their image, they kind of approached us because they were frustrated by the fact that any insulated sampling trolley on the market was just a horrible looking thing that just didn't align with them at all. And so the fact that we could come up with a concept as well as manufacture it, it kind of skips a whole bunch of steps in terms of how do you communicate this to external fabricators in a way which is efficient for a quantity which probably doesn't warrant that amount of effort. Like it's kind of about keeping the process really lean. So these, they aren't necessarily overly exciting, but there's still a lot of care and consideration that went into making sure that this would work for them, but also represent who they were visually when they're using them. So Aesop as well has come back to us a few times. This was a really challenging but interesting project where they were closing down one of their stores and opening a flagship store in Sydney. So there was this gap where customers would be going to their old store and then being told that there was actually a new store somewhere else. So this was set up in the main kind of thoroughfare area to just try and grab people and redirect them to the new store. And it was there for 2 weeks. And the brief was quite challenging in that it had to, well, again, we made it in Melbourne, shipped it to Sydney, and we had a 2-hour window to bump in and install everything. So it kind of had to be systems based and very modular and easy to set up. But the other challenge of working for a company like Aesop is that their brand vision and the way that they think about all aspects of how they're presented to the customer is pretty intense. And so, you know, ideas of texture and making things feel like something that people would want to interact with. I mean, any other company could have probably just, I don't know, bought some off-the-shelf things or tables or whatever. But to go to this level for something that was there for 2 weeks was an interesting dilemma, because you try to make it something that is desirable or has value, but then you also have to make it accordingly in terms of materials and costs. So we came up with this idea of replicating a tactile surface over and over again and just installing it on like a cube matrix to kind of fill the space. And so we created this jig where we could basically scree a tinted plaster onto a substrate and create all these textured tiles into these modular cubes that they could kind of merchandise. And it was all super lightweight, and yeah, it didn't actually involve too much material. It just took a bit of time to kind of work out the process. So all of the structures were just steel rod, again, super lightweight, because the reality of the situation is that it's probably just going to get scrapped for steel. The one thing that was nice about this, though, is that the tiles were created in a way that Aesop knew that they could put them into storage and then possibly merchandise further down the track with these textures, because they were so easy to transport and quite universal in what they could be applied to. So that was part of the design brief. Again, you'll figure out, I guess in my line of work, that there's a bit of a snowball that happens in terms of clients that keep coming back to you. I guess that means that they like the work, but also you get enough people that it's kind of like a cycle that's on repeat. So, you know, we do all this work, and then at this point, Napier Quarter had come back and said, oh, we need a whole bunch of tables. The challenge with this one was that they had some existing, they're super particular as well about the visual fit out, but they had these 1930s sandcast aluminum pedestals, and they were saying that, oh, we'd kind of like to keep the vision the same or have a similar style of pedestal for these tables, which again, low volume production, sandcasting, I don't know, maybe if you had an in with a place, that might become something that's feasible, but it wasn't really feasible for the quantities that they wanted. They only needed like 11 tables. So we came up with a couple of concepts, but we ended up here with this kind of tessellated stitched sheet metal process, which quite closely matched the overall form and feel of the really old vintage bases that they couldn't order anymore, but was a totally different process. So that was an interesting challenge to kind of work through. And they also have a very, not vintage feel, but they don't really like things that look entirely new. So part of the process was, how do you age them in a way that they're going to sit in the space comfortably and not be this gleaming, shiny thing compared to a whole bunch of really old, worn artifacts. So this is blackened stainless steel, and the intention with these kind of faceted edges is that as people's feet are rubbing on them, they'll start to reveal the more bright steel color underneath. And the sandcast ones, the aluminium ones, they were painted black, and they actually have the same thing happening where all of those sharp edges have been worn off to reveal the bare silver aluminium below. So I don't know, it's kind of using new processes and new techniques to match something which was actually quite old, which was interesting. We also did some chairs for them. And this is the other thing which is kind of crazy, because it's like, you look at a lot of businesses and why would you why would you bother trying to go through the process of trying to design something specific and have it made in such low volume when the math doesn't necessarily work out for what a lot of businesses would want to do with their cash flow. But again, going back to that idea of community, that's really built into their entire ethos. So I think it's interesting that they have prioritized that to the point that they, do spend a little bit more on having something specifically made for them. So these were some tubular bent chairs. These are just mild steel, and then they were hot dip galvanized, which was a challenge in itself. But anyway, so this is a little video to show this idea of low volume production. It really involves setting up processes in a way which you can minimize the amount of work that you need to do, because even making, I think we made 32 of these chairs. When you multiply that over all of the processes, it starts to add up really quickly. And so the challenge with production like this is how do you visualize the most effective method of doing something before you then decide to just commit and go all in and make all of them. So yeah, that was, I don't know, lots of visualizing before actually doing it. And in some cases, you'd set up the jigs for what you thought was going to work, and you would do one and realize, okay, that step's totally redundant. How can I, even save one clamp or something like that? It's kind of an interesting problem-solving space to be in that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily get the chance to kind of think about. Also, with the building industry, there's a big demand for custom work. So again, it's kind of applying the same types of processes and thinking to, I don't know, I guess it's something which is a little bit more boring and not necessarily inspiring, but there's still an ability to, build in a lot of really interesting details. And even something like this involves a lot of problem solving. So this was a recent project, and it's kind of funny because I look at this now, and I think from an outside perspective, anyone who walks into this office and looks at this thing will be like, oh yeah, it's just like a big rectangle. Anyway, so they had, this is an architect's office that you come out of the elevators and you're basically spit directly into the floor where everyone's working on their computers, and they wanted a bit of separation. So they'd ordered all these Planex cabinets, and they knew that they wanted it kind of clad in something that was a bit more futuristic or specific looking. And the crazy thing is that that middle image, that's the corner radius detail folded out of a single sheet to kind of create this meeting point on the corner. That was like the entire premise and drive behind the project. And then that bend radius, this is a 12-meter long partition. So you can kind of, when you walk around to the side of this, you can sight that radius detail across the full 12 meters of this partition. Anyway, totally wild in terms of how much like technical detailing was required to actually deliver something as simple as this. And this is why I'm saying it's kind of funny that most people will probably not even, really look at this for very long at all. But when I look at this, it's like overwhelming how much time actually went into making sure that this was going to work. And that's part of the challenge when I kind of mentioned low volume production. Like it's a little bit like gambling, and a little bit like you have to rely on your inherent knowledge of how materials work and try to preempt challenges. And it's really satisfying when it works first time. And I think it's quite rare that things don't work out. But that's, yeah, some of the problem solving and risk involved in that low volume production side is quite interesting to me. This is another recent thing that we've been working on. So this is color changing lighting, which uses this wild film. But again, like this is the type of thing that if you wanted to get another company to make, there'd probably be a lot of process in terms of prototyping and then scaling that idea up into units which are viable. And I think there was 12 of these made just for a particular exhibition. So there wasn't even an intention that these were going to be a long-term product or anything like that. But this was quite an interesting one, using polycarbonate sheet and creating a fold detail, which meant there was no internal support blocking the lighting from the front of these rectangles. Yeah, so I think in summary, I've come up with this like niche equation. And I think it's important to find a niche, whether you're going to be working in a larger team of people. There's an importance to find, what your niche is as a designer bringing a range of skills to that team. But in my case, as a business, I need to figure out what my niche is. So I've kind of figured out that a lot of companies and brands, many of which are quite small, they need creative and bespoke products or solutions to represent their unique identity to the world. And so I combine that with a lean design practice and try to consider many, many aspects, develop creative concepts, and then have the ability to, manufacture them in-house in many cases. There's a little asterisk there because, of course, I outsource many things because I'm not an expert in all methods of making. But that allows, really creative outcomes which are low in volume and feasible from a cost perspective. And I guess I use this as an equation because if I remove that middle component of what my design practice is, the equation will only spit out outcomes which are really high volume to maintain a low cost, or outcomes which are incredibly expensive because the volume just doesn't suit what a lot of these companies and brands are after. So yeah, I think that's all I have for giving you a bit of a run through. So hopefully that's been enough to think about some questions maybe. And yeah, let's see where this goes.
Wonderful. Dustin, thank you so much for your talk. That was fantastic. Cecilia, did you want to say a quick thank you or anything?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. That was really cool. Oh my God. I actually had a question about what was it like starting your own company? Did you already have like a bit of clout to begin with, or was there some like pushing your name out there?
Okay, well that's interesting because I was thinking about this, and everyone knows the cliche about it's not what you know, but it's who you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's actually accurate. It's very much about what you know. But it doesn't hurt to know people for sure, because I look at all of the work that I've either reflected on as being the most important work I've done or the most exciting work. All of that has been through, opportunities created through relationships that I have with people. It's funny, I work with some other people who have their own businesses in like a shared workshop environment. And some of them went down the avenue of search engine optimization, super prolific Instagram, social media. I always get made fun of because I'm rubbish at that stuff. Like, I'm not good at social media. Yet they were the people that were getting like really small, finicky requests in terms of things that they wanted made, and they turned into these nightmares. And so the beauty of having work through recommendation or through relationships is you already weed out an entire range of things that you would have no control or understanding of, and you end up in a space which is quite similar to why you end up having relationships with those people to begin with. So in terms of starting a business, I mean, the confidence was there because of all of the people that I'd worked with and who have helped me so much in terms of getting work. But I mean, the decision to start a company or not, I think if you start thinking about employees and human resources and all of that, so, like, that's a whole other conversation that I didn't have to entertain. The motivation for me to start a company was primarily driven by the fact that I didn't like attaching my name to stuff. And from a scalability perspective, if your name is your company, people will only ever see that as your work. Whereas when you are operating under a separate entity, there's opportunity to adapt and change and not have things directly attached to you. So I think that was more in my head why I decided to do that. But also, I mean, from a business perspective, it comes down to also how do you pay yourself. And so like a lot of designers would end up being sole traders. Well, there's financial limits to when that works for a person or when it doesn't. So I don't know. There's so many variables in why somebody would start a company, but I guess maybe those are some of mine.
Justin, I thought I knew you. Now I've seen your presentation, I'm just like, wow, seriously, I'm really a fan.
Oh, thank you.
In regards to when you came out of university, did you feel that you had the skill sets that you had to launch you into your career as what you selected? So did you actually, I guess my real question that I really wanted to ask is looking back at yourself, you know, and when you came out of university, do you feel that you could give yourself advice on what kind of things you should have and what things you would like to have so that it would strengthen going forward?
I mean, I look back at university, and it's always the case where I think when you reflect on something, you wish you could go back because you enjoyed it so much. So I look back quite fondly on my experience at university. But I think the thing that is something that was told to me while I was at uni and is still being, you know, taught to students, I think, is to, and it didn't make sense to me. I didn't know what to do with the information at that point. But I think the idea of not treating yourself as a student while you're at university allows you to open up the scope of your work and see it as, you know, more formative to creating a practice from studying rather than waiting for studying to be completed before you can then start to see yourself as a designer. And so I guess there would be a little bit more emphasis on trying to make, you know, responses to assignments and stuff like that, trying to make it a little bit more commercially not because I'm, you know, it's suggesting that students need to actually take all of their projects to a much bigger, more commercially viable place, but just having that mindset of, you know, this project could be something, and I have skills already that could contribute to something larger than just a grade on an assignment. So yeah, I guess that's what I would tell myself.
Wonderful. Cecilia, did you want to ask that question in the chat?
Yeah. So Lenny says, written two questions. First one is, have you tried to narrow down to sticking towards one particular category, such as leaning more towards either furniture or lighting, or do you enjoy or prefer to be a maker of all sorts of things and have more variety?
Yeah, I mentioned before that I have anti-pants, so I get asked a question a lot about, you know, why don't you just design a range of products and like just make those or start to get them made? And I've never been able to work out what that would mean for my brain, because after something gets to a point where it's like I've learned everything and, you know, resolved, I don't know, I want to move on. And so I can't sit still long enough to commit to the idea of saying, oh, I'm just a lighting designer or I'm a furniture designer. And so, yeah, all of these weird and wonderful things that people are suggesting they'd like to work on, like that's the exciting part to me, as opposed to just focusing on one area. So yeah, I guess I'm on all sorts maker as opposed to a particular category.
Okay. And the second part to that question is, or did anyone ever try to tell you to stay in like that one lane, or yeah, if they did, like how did you kind of push out of that? How did you combat that when you know when you're more than capable of doing more than one thing, especially when you're passionate about everything, and why?
That's interesting. I mean, the biggest person that tells me that all the time is probably myself. I don't know. There is this idea of being definable or having a concise statement to what it is that you do. And I mean, it's funny because we were talking about Japan at the beginning of this, and culturally, I think, you know, even still, there's this idea that your family is really amazing at doing a thing, and it's most likely that you will also carry that on. Whereas I feel now, I don't know, especially out of COVID. But I feel like we're entering a territory where things aren't necessarily as definable or as clear in terms of saying, oh, I do this. This is my job. Like lots of people are starting side hustles or contemplating startups to exit the career that they've been in for a really long time. So I often think in my head, like, maybe I do need to clarify what it is that I do and just focus on this one thing. I think it also potentially makes sense from a business perspective to do that and really clarify what it is that you're doing. So I am constantly battling that within myself, but I also do have this slightly alternate view. I don't know, maybe it's slightly resistant, but to the idea of pace and consumerism and fast and the intensity of some of these projects, whether it be in turnaround time or, the risk involved in what would happen if something doesn't work out. Like it does, that whole environment starts to get a bit exhausting. And so I guess as a bit of a pushback for having this really clear strategy about, I don't know, growing way bigger or hiring lots of people or whatever it is, there's part of me which is like, I kind of enjoy being small. And I kind of enjoy having this world where I understand and enjoy what I'm doing, and to restrict that or to try and push myself to become something bigger or something clear that I'm not. I don't know. I struggle with that. So it's juggling all the time. You don't really ever switch off when you're working for yourself. And I often envy people who are working for other companies who show up Monday to Friday. I'm not saying that work stress wouldn't come home, because it absolutely would. Like designers often get so invested in what it is that they're working on that it doesn't matter if you work for yourself or for a large consultancy, you're still going to have stress. But the thing that which is weird about working for yourself is it literally never stops, because you're in full control of deciding what happens. So that I think that juggling and trying to tackle mentally, like what should I be doing or where should I be going, is a really difficult part. But yeah, I don't know if I've answered the question, but perhaps that gives you some perspective.
Absolutely. We've got a question from the lovely Sumitri. You have been teaching for many years. What do you enjoy about teaching, and especially about my first 6 months?
Okay. My first 6 months specifically, my favorite part is actually, I guess, kind of what was summarized in Tim's talk yesterday, but this notion of resistance to saying, or the idea that like tutors are above and students are below, and they are there to absorb the knowledge and all wonderful things that tutors have. I remember my experience at uni, and I told my students this today as well, but I was very resistant to just responding to a brief. Like I didn't like the idea of just doing I don't know, what made sense for a brief. I always tried to kind of mold it into something that I actually wanted to do. And so I think what I like about my first 6 months is it's not set up in a way where your tutor is supposed to tell you what to do, or like give off this impression that they know more and therefore you should be listening to their advice. Like it's more about the idea of facilitation. And I feel like a glorified MC half the time, because it's like, all I'm really doing is making sure people are presenting at the right time, but the students are actually the ones that are creating the experience and driving everything. So that's what I love about, teaching my first 6 months. In terms of teaching, I don't know, to be honest, like the teaching aspect of my life, it was not something that I finished university and was like, I know, I'm going to teach. And I was quite resistant to the idea initially, because I had this demon inside me, which was like, you don't know enough, you haven't experienced enough as a designer, why would you think that you could be in a position to also teach others? But that's what's, again, great about the my first 6 months thing, is I don't I don't know, perhaps not being a designer would actually be a really good facilitator for this course because that would really force somebody to say, I don't know, but I'm here to facilitate whatever that experience is. But there is a lot of joy that you get from being able to distance yourself from the stress of a project. Like, I think because I'm so used to wanting to dive in and solve problems from a work pace, that it's really nice to be able to present problems and I don't know, see how that process unfolds without me personally investing my problem solving in that idea, and watching that happen and seeing really wild and wonderful responses to things that, if I was responding to some of these briefs within my first 6 months, I'd probably have a very different approach. But that's the beauty of teaching, is you have literally no idea what's going to happen, and you don't get to control it. So I think that's what's enjoyable about teaching.
Lovely. Cecilia, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, but before that, sorry, Ben. Do you reckon you've actually picked anything up from watching the students work, like with their own
Oh, 100%.
process?
I mean, pretty much every class I leave feeling inadequate because of all these new skills that first year designers apparently just inherently come into the course with, and I'm not even yeah, there's tons of things that I learn from students all the time.
We're sorry. Okay, and then Ben had a question. Did the practice of design and research aid your work in designing and producing low volume products? Practices of design, yeah.
I guess the research element was not something that probably helped in terms of knowing that low volume production was a problem I liked solving. What I would say about the research stuff was that you end up working with a lot of different types of industries or different fields. So on a lot of projects, there was teams of scientists, or there was teams of mechanical engineers, or CEOs and people who are driving the startup process of a new company, or whatever it might be. And what I found most interesting from that was the role of a designer. You may think is just about creating this beautiful package which brings all of these elements together into a user experience which somebody can easily understand. But the skills that we have as designers is actually really applicable to working in collaborative groups. And I don't know whether it's ideas of empathy or understanding in the way that we go through user-centered design or human-centered design projects. But watching some of these meetings unfold when all of these people would come together to have big project meetings, and the communication would start to crumble so quickly, I actually found my skills as a designer allowed me to almost become a moderator within those environments and be like, I think what they're saying is this, and that's the information that you guys need in order to move forward. It's really funny that, yeah, I mean, I was there for a particular reason, but the skills that you have as a designer are applicable in other areas. So I think that's maybe what I learned most from the research side of things, was about collaboration between different fields and how you actually can bring that together. And that, for anyone, I don't know, Simitri, how many people have been shared the link for the Tilt talk that we had with Tim Phillips the other day? But it's a similar scenario, because he was kind of talking about the work that he does within architecture and construction. And there are so many players there who aren't necessarily good at communicating with one another because the languages are so different. And it's almost like Tilt as a studio is a moderator between all of these different parties in order to bring really technical, super complicated projects to life. So yeah, I think the research side, I don't even feel involved in a lot of the research in terms of like case studies, workshops, interviews. I was never involved in any of that stuff, which I kind of liked, to be honest, but I was along for the ride. Yeah. Anyway, again, hopefully that answered some of that question.
Wonderful. I think there's lots of questions we want to ask you, but I am mindful that we're coming up to an hour. So I also know that there's particular questions on your skill sets. You know, obviously coming out of university, you've worked in metals, 3D printing, all this lighting, obviously research with Leah. So the metal making though, is that something that you've learnt through uni, or is that something you learnt outside?
Do you mean in terms of like steel fabrication and welding and all of that stuff?
Sand casting and yep.
That's all just learn as you go. I think if you're motivated to do something, it's really not required to have courses to teach you. And I think there's even a comment. Oh, there it is. Simitri's already on the autodidact. I think there's something on the My First 6 Months website about that, and it's fascinating, especially now. I remember like being a kid and going to the library and getting encyclopedias, and that was like the extent of, wow, there's so much information we can absorb. But now it's like hilariously easy. Anything that you want to do, you can absorb so quickly, but it requires the motivation and the passion to actually do something with that information. Otherwise, it's just noise. And that's the same as what I was meaning about the question about if I could tell myself something. You know, I wasn't ready to hear myself tell myself that in uni, right? It just went over my head. So it's really interesting that you need to get to a point of critical mass of motivation before you actually have the determination to do something with all this amazing information that we have around us. So yeah, all of the learnings from steel and fabrication, that's you just throw yourself into it, and yeah, it's pretty easy to pick up.
Okay. I hope you guys don't mind. We just got a little bit over time. If I can just squeeze in one last question from the chat. We have, how do you know when something is worth making in and producing in low volume? And second part to that is also, how do you establish a good middle ground between low volume production and sustainability?
I mean, that's interesting to bring sustainability into the question, but how do you know when something's worth producing in low volume? I think depending on what the design is, it will already be clear as to whether it's meant for low volume production versus mass manufacture. So all of the stuff that I showed you in terms of the work that I'm doing recently, like the design is created in a way which is supposed to be manufactured in low volume. None of those things that have been created in the way that I manufactured them would be feasible to create at mass scale. So I think to answer that, yeah, it's got to be answered even before the design is created, and that's how you kind of know about that. Establishing a good middle ground between low volume production and sustainability, is that more the material environmental impacts sustainability world, or are we talking about costs and feasibility from budgets sustainability?
I think both.
Bit of both. Well, I think it becomes really clear, like when you're dealing with clients, a lot of the time they'll come to you with this cloudy idea of something that they want to create, and you need to go through some hypothetical costing scenario to get them to a point where they're like, yep, I can jump on board, or like, whoa, that's totally not something I can deal with. It tends to be that the costs of creating low volumes of things is incredibly high. And it's a real problem from a business standpoint for me to fight through the huge consumer market, which is filled with mass manufactured stuff. Because like those chairs, you know, if you costed those to something that you can buy in a store, people would be like, that is nuts. Like, why would you spend that much on a chair that looks like every other chair? It wouldn't make sense. And so I think, I don't know, maybe there isn't really a middle ground between low volume production and mass manufacture. And I guess that's kind of what I'm meaning about finding my niches, that the low volume side is something that I think a lot of people need or maybe don't necessarily know exists. Anyone who's dealt with packaging before, like companies who, let's say they want to start a cosmetics brand. They're like, oh yeah, great, you know, okay, I need some packaging. And as soon as you start Googling packaging, you're faced with the acronym MOQ, minimum order quantities. And it's alarming when you start to realize how, like, oh, I need to order a 40-foot container of packaging in order to get things to a price that actually, like, and it crushes people's dreams really, really quickly. So I think that idea of, yeah, low volume production is, I kind of realized that there is a lot of need for it, but I don't think there is a lot of middle ground between that and then going up to mass manufacture. You kind of have to commit to your idea and know that it's viable and know that it's going to work before you invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in tooling. And, you know, there's a whole other run-on effect of mass manufacture that would need to be solved.
Dustin, I just wanted to also question one last thing. Just to keep it really short, where do you want to be in a couple of years' time? What direction? Are you happy where you are, and do you not want to change, or you kind of get that bug and you want to change?
Literally every day I wake up. Where I think, I don't know, it's funny that I struggle with long-term plans, and I always have. People talk about 5-year plans and 10-year plans. I don't know, and it's also the same. I tell my students this about Gantt charts, right? We ask students to create Gantt charts as a way of scheduling their projects, and I create Gantt charts and never look at them the whole project. It's just the act. It's just the act of creating the Gantt chart that allows me to internalize the schedule and the stress, and then I don't use it anymore. So I'm operating on like an amount of inherent trust within myself. And so I guess to answer your question, I'm really hoping there's some inherent trust that's going on. That means where I'm going in the next 2 years is where I'm supposed to be.
So you're not going to go and do further research, like a master's or a PhD? That's a question from Dimitri.
There have been some questions about that. So it's in there. I don't know what to do with it yet. So I'll get back to you.
Let's talk. Wonderful, Dustin. Well, thank you so much. That was so informative, and it's like I've looked behind the curtain, I've seen Dustin, you know, it's a beautiful picture. You've really shown what kind of things you've been up to, so it's very exciting times. Guys, thank you so much. Cecilia, did you have anything you want to say?
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know. I feel like that was pretty inspiring to me, like as a student, to think like, yeah, I don't have to like go the complete get into a firm route. I could just do my own thing. I can just, you know, hop around, see what interests me, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What a great response. Absolutely. Dimitri, did you want to say anything?
Just that he wants me to do a PhD.
Dimitri, you have so many PhD students. Come on.
I think Dimitri's
enough.
I think he's trying to get one for me.
Oh, there he is.
He's moving now.
Yeah. Tomorrow is Elan, lighting designer maker at 11 a.m. for those who are interested, and Malta will share the talk. And thank you, Dustin. Brilliant as always.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Dustin.
Thanks, everyone.